She was 18 years old the winter she was turned out of the only home she had ever known, with a wool cloak, a tin of buttons, and $11 sewn into the hem of her skirt. Her father, Ezra Halloran of Ashford, Ohio, cast her out for refusing to marry Silas Kingsley, a lumber baron 30 years, her elder, who had offered to save the failing Halloran mill in exchange for her hand. When she said no, her father said she was no longer his daughter, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a coffin lid. With the little she had, she rode a freight west until the money nearly ran out. And in a mud-rutted town in the Nebraska Territory, she paid $9 for a broken-down wagon that had sat abandoned behind the livery for 3 years, its wheels sunk, its canvas gone to rags. Everyone told her it was a fool's purchase, a dead thing bought by a girl with nowhere left to fall. But sealed beneath its rotting floor was something forgotten by the whole town, something that would not only remake her life, but give a dying place its water, its faith, and its future back. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Clara Halloran. If you're watching this from a place the world seems to have forgotten, a town that dried up, or a life that was written off before you got the chance to prove otherwise, stay with us a while and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. To understand what Clara did with that wagon, you have to understand the hands that were shaped to do it, and those hands were shaped long before the door in Ashford ever closed. She was born the second of the Halloran children in a house that smelled of sawdust and river damp, where the whine of the mill wheel was the first sound she knew and the last she heard each night. Her mother, Adeline, was a careful, quiet woman who had come from people who mended rather than bought, who turned collars and darned heels, and could make a single ham last a household through February. It was Adeline who taught Clara that nothing was ever truly worthless, that the world was full of things folks discarded only because they lacked the patience to see them clearly. They would walk the riverbank after the spring floods, the two of them, and gather what the water left behind, waterlogged crates and bent hinges, and lengths of good rope gone stiff with silt, and Clara's mother would turn each piece over in her red-knuckled hands and say, softly, that there was a use in everything if you were willing to wait for it to show itself. Her father was a different sort, a man who measured his worth in board feet and ledger columns, who loved his family the way a man loves a good investment, fiercely and conditionally. In the early years, the mill did well, and Ezra Halloran walked the main street of Ashford like a man who owned the ground, tipping his hat to the bankers and the deacons, letting his children want for nothing so long as they never embarrassed him. Clara learned early that his affection was a currency and that it could be withdrawn. But she also learned in the long hours she spent in the mill loft where she wasn't supposed to be, how machines fit together and came apart, how a stripped gear could be shimmed, how a thing that groaned and failed could be coaxed back to life by someone who bothered to understand it. The men who worked the saws grew used to the girl who asked too many questions, and one of them, an old millwright named Peter Voss, who had lost 3 fingers to the trade, taught her to read the grain of wood the way other girls were taught to read scripture. He told her that timber remembered everything that had ever happened to it, every drought and every fat wet year, and that if you knew how to look, a plank could tell you its whole history. Her mother died of pleurisy the winter. Clara turned 14, coughing in a cold upstairs room while the mill roared on beneath her, and something in the house died with her. Ezra remarried within the year, a brittle, ambitious woman named Ophelia, who had opinions about how a young lady ought to comport herself, and no patience for a stepdaughter who came to supper with grease under her nails. The mill began to falter around the same time, undercut by bigger operations upriver and by Ezra's own pride, which would not let him modernize or ask for help. Debts gathered like crows. And into this failing house came the offer that would break it open, carried on the polished boots of Silas Kingsley, who had bought up half the timber rights in 3 counties and wanted, for reasons he never troubled to disguise, a young and pretty wife to grace the enormous cold house he was building on the hill. He would settle the Halloran debts, he said, as a wedding gift. All he required was the girl. Clara was 17 when the arrangement was first spoken of over the supper table, as though she were a parcel of land under negotiation, and she was 18 when it came to its ruin. She had met Silas Kingsley 3 times, and each time she had come away feeling as though she had stood too long in a shadow. There was nothing kind in the man, nothing that so much as pretended at kindness. He looked at her the way her father looked at standing timber, calculating the yield. She learned from a laundress whose sister had worked in the Kingsley house that his first wife had died young and strange, and that the servants did not speak of it. And she knew with the deep animal certainty of the young that to marry him would be to be buried alive in a fine dress. So on the evening, the papers were to be signed with the lawyer already seated in the parlor and Ophelia arranging the good china. Clara Halloran stood in the doorway and said, in a voice that did not shake, though everything in her was shaking, that she would not do it. What followed, she would carry the rest of her days. Her father did not shout. That was the worst of it, that he did not shout. He set down his pen very carefully and looked at her as though she had already ceased to exist. And he said that a daughter who would ruin her family for the sake of her own vanity was no daughter of his, and that she could take her ingratitude out the door she had darkened. Ophelia said nothing, but could not quite hide the satisfaction in her face. The lawyer studied his papers, and Silas Kingsley, unbothered, merely remarked that she would come to regret her foolishness, that a woman alone in the world was a very poor and fragile thing, and that he would not be waiting when she came crawling back. Clara went upstairs and packed what her stepmother would let her keep, which was almost nothing, and in the dark before dawn, her mother's old friend the cook pressed $11 into her hands and helped her thread a needle to sew it into her hem, weeping, and told her to go far and not to look behind her. She did not look behind her. She rode the mail coach as far as her first dollar would take her and then found work she could get, scrubbing an inn's floors for a week, minding a widow's children for the price of a bed, all the while moving west, because west was where the debts and the shame and the long shadow of Silas Kingsley could not follow. It was a hard, hungry passage, and there were nights she lay in strange rooms and let herself imagine the warm parlor she'd walked away from, and asked herself whether pride was worth the cold. But every time she remembered the way Kingsley had looked at her, the answer came back the same. She sold the tin of buttons in Missouri for the price of 2 meals. She mended a stranger's harness on the trail and was given a ride for it. And by the time she reached the raw little town of Larkspur in the Nebraska Territory, in the gray thaw of early 1869, she was down to her mother's teaching, her millwright's hands, and the $11 still stitched into her skirt. And she was so tired she could have wept, except that she had learned somewhere along the road that weeping cost energy she could not spare. Larkspur was a town that looked as though it had been started with great hope and then quietly given up on. It sat in a shallow valley where a good spring had once made the grass grow sweet. But the spring, folks said, had been fenced off by the land company, and now the town paid dear for every barrel of water hauled from it. The main street was a single stretch of frost-heaved mud, lined with false-fronted buildings, half of them empty, their windows papered over. There was a church with no preacher and a school with no teacher, and a great many people wearing the particular thinness of those who are not quite starving but have forgotten what it is to be full. Clara took a cot in the back of the boarding house, run by a sharp-eyed widow named Hetty Mira, and she paid for it by fixing the woman's broken stove, and while she worked, she listened, because listening had kept her alive for 400 miles. She learned that the town was dying by inches, squeezed by the Overland Land and Water Company, whose local agent, a smooth, cold man named Alden Cruz, had bought up the water and the best land and now let the town wither so he could buy the rest for nothing. And she learned that behind the livery, sunk to its axles and forgotten, there sat an old wagon that had belonged to the Amsdens, the very family who had founded Larkspur and then died, all of them in the fever summer 3 years gone. She went to look at it on her second morning, drawn by something she could not have named, and she stood a long while in the gray light with her hand on its splintered sideboard. It was a heavy old freighter's wagon, the kind built to cross a continent, its iron tires rusted, its bonnet long since rotted away, its bed full of the drifted leaves and mouse nests of 3 abandoned years. But her hands, running along the frame, felt what her eyes could not yet see, that the timber was good, that it had been built by someone who loved the work, that under the ruin there was a bone-deep soundness the weather had not managed to kill. The livery man, a stooped and kindly fellow named Gus Pelletier, told her she could have the wretched thing for $10 and be doing him a favor, since he'd been meaning for years to haul it off and never had the heart. She talked him to $9. She unpicked her hem right there in the cold and paid him in coin still warm from her body, and the town, when it heard, laughed the tired laugh of people who have nothing better to do, and said the millman's daughter had come all the way west to buy a corpse. She did not mind the laughter. She had heard worse. She borrowed a spade and a stiff brush and set to work, and for 2 days She cleaned that wagon as though it were a body being readied for something sacred, and in a way it was. She shoveled out the rot and the leaves, she scrubbed the boards, she oiled the frozen hardware and worked the wheels loose from the frozen ground, and all the while, old Peter Voss's teaching moved through her hands, telling her what was sound and what was spent. And it was on the third morning, kneeling in the wagon bed with the brush, that she felt it, a wrongness under the boards, a hollow note where there should have been the solid answer of the earth beneath. She sat back on her heels. She pressed again, tapping, and the sound came back thin and false, the way old Voss had taught her a hidden joint would sound, and Clara Halloran's heart began to beat very hard in the cold and quiet, because she knew, the way she knew the grain of wood, that the floor of the wagon was not a floor at all, but a lid. It took her the better part of that day to open it without ruining it, working with a chisel borrowed from Gus and a patience her whole life had trained into her. And when at last the false floor lifted away on its clever hidden hinges, she found beneath it a shallow, well-made compartment lined with tin against the damp, and in that compartment, wrapped in waxed oilcloth, gone brittle with the years, a bundle the size of a family Bible. Her hands shook as she lifted it out. She did not open it in the livery where any eye might see. Some instinct, some memory of how quickly the world takes what it thinks it can, made her carry it back through the mud to her cot at Hetty Mira's and wait until the house was asleep. And there, by the light of a single candle stub she'd saved, Clara unwrapped the oilcloth and found the thing that would change everything. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, swollen and soft with age, but legible, and folded inside its cover a sheaf of papers heavy with wax seals, and beneath those, wrapped separately, a small canvas sack that clinked when she moved it, and a packet of letters bound in faded ribbon. She read the letters first, because it was the letters that had the human hand in them, and by the second page she was weeping after all, quietly, in the dark, though she had thought herself past it. They had been written by a woman named Margaret Amsden to her sister back in Pennsylvania, and they told, in a plain and loving voice, the whole story of Larkspur, how Margaret and her husband Josiah had come west with everything they owned in this very wagon, how they had found the sweet spring and knelt down and thanked God for it, how they had meant from the very beginning that the water would never be owned by any one man but held in trust for every soul who came to settle there. They had filed the papers to make it so. They had put the deed to the spring and the surrounding sections into a trust, a legal trust, with the water held in common for the people of Larkspur forever, and they had hidden the documents in the wagon's false floor for safekeeping while the courthouse was being built, meaning to record them properly when the territory was better settled. And then the fever had come and taken Josiah first, and then the children, and finally Margaret herself, and the last letter, unfinished, unsent, trailed off in a shaking hand that spoke of thirst and of trusting that God would see the water kept for the poor. No one had ever known. The wagon had been hauled behind the livery with the rest of the dead family's goods, and the trust had slept in its belly for 3 years while Alden Cruz and the Overland Land and Water Company quietly stole the very thing the Amstons had died to protect. Clara sat with the ledger open on her knees until the candle guttered out, and then she sat in the dark, and she understood several things at once with the terrible clarity that comes only a few times in a life. She understood that the papers in her hands were worth more than any inheritance, not because they held gold, though the little sack, she would find, held 40 gold, double eagles. The Amsdens had set aside to build the town its school, but because they held the truth, and the truth, properly recorded, would break Alden Cruz's grip on the whole valley. She understood that the water cruise was selling barrel by barrel to a dying town did not belong to him at all, had never belonged to him, was held in a trust that made every dollar he'd taken a theft, and she understood with a chill that was almost like recognition that the Overland Land and Water Company was not some faceless thing that she had seen its name before on the fine cream stationery in her father's parlor the night the papers were to be signed. Because Overland was one of the many hands of Silas Kingsley, the man she had crossed a continent to escape. The shadow had been here waiting all along, and now she held the thing that could end it. She did not sleep. By morning she had made her decision, and it was not the decision a frightened girl makes, but the one her mother would have made, standing on the riverbank with something the water had thrown away, turning slowly in her patient hands. She could have taken the 40 gold coins and slipped out of Larkspur before dawn, and started a life somewhere no one had ever heard of Silas Kingsley or the Hallorans, and no one would ever have known or blamed her. The gold alone was more money than she had ever held. But she thought of Margaret Amsden's shaking handwriting of the poor, and she thought of the thin faces in the church with no preacher, the children in the school with no teacher, and she found that the woman she had become on the long road west simply could not do it. The water was not hers to keep. It was not Cruz's to sell. It belonged to the town, and she had been given by some grace she did not understand the power to give it back. She went first to the one person she had learned to trust, Hetty Mira, and laid the papers on the boarding house table and let the sharp-eyed widow read them and watched the color drain and then flood back into the woman's face. Hetty had known the Amsdens. She had wept at their burying, and when she understood what Clara held, she gripped the girl's wrist so hard it left marks and said that Cruz would kill her for those pages, that men had disappeared in that valley for far less and that they would have to move very carefully indeed. Together they brought in the few in Larkspur who still had backbone left. Gus Pelletier, the livery man, a former soldier named Amos Lott who ran the freight route, and old Reverend Whitcomb, who had lost his church when he could no longer pay Cruz for water to keep his garden and his flock alive. In the back room of the boarding house, by lamplight, Clara read them Margaret Amsden's letters, and she watched grown men who had given up on everything, remember, slowly, painfully, what it felt like to hope. Alden Cruz learned of it within the week because towns are small and fear runs downhill, and he did precisely what a man like him always does. He came to the boarding house in his good coat with 2 hard men behind him and sat himself at Hetty's table uninvited, and he was very smooth and very reasonable, and he explained to the girl, as though to a child, that whatever old papers she imagined she had found were surely forgeries or expired or of no legal weight, and that in any case the Overland Company's claim was recorded and lawful, and that a wise young woman new to town would do well to sell him the wagon and its contents, and take a generous sum and move along before there were misunderstandings. When Clara said quietly that the papers were a recorded trust, and that they were already in safekeeping where he could not reach them, which was a bluff, for she had not yet recorded anything, his smoothness slipped for just a moment, and she saw the thing underneath it, the same cold calculation she had seen in Silas Kingsley's eyes across her father's supper table, and she knew she had made a true enemy. He rose, and he said, still smiling, that the roads west were dangerous, that fires happened, that a young woman ought to think of her safety. And then he left, and the room was very quiet, and Amos Lott said what they were all thinking, which was that they had, until Cruz decided the smiling was over. The days that followed were the hardest and the finest of Clara's life. She understood that the papers were only as strong as the law that recorded them, and that Cruz owned the local clerk and very likely the local judge, and so the trusts would have to be recorded not in Larkspur, but at the Territorial Land Office 3 days hard ride east in the county seat where Overland's reach was thinner. And she understood that Cruz would try to stop her on that road because a fire or a fall could solve his problem cleanly. So they made a plan that used the very thing the town had, which was that everyone underestimated them. Amos Lott would take the freight wagon east along the main road in a great show of hurry, as though carrying something precious, and let Cruz's men follow him and waste their strength chasing an empty box. And Clara, dressed as a hired girl of no importance, would go quietly north on an old mail trail with the papers sewn into her skirt the same way her $11 had once been, because she had learned that a woman the world overlooks can carry anything past it. Reverend Whitcomb blessed them both at the edge of town in the dark, and Hetty pressed food into Clara's hands, and Gus gave her the steadiest horse in the livery, and Clara Halloran rode north into the gray dawn, carrying a dead woman's dying wish against her skin. Cruz's men took the bait, most of them, and Amos Lott led them a hard and profitless chase down the eastern road and lost them in the breaks by the river with the empty strongbox that had once held 40 coins. But Cruz was no fool, and he had kept one rider back, a lean and watchful man who had noticed the hired girl leave north before dawn, and on the second day of Clara's ride she knew she was being followed. She did not run, because running told a hunter what he needed to know. She kept the plain, patient pace of a servant on an errand, and when the trail narrowed through a stand of cottonwoods along a creek, she used the thing she knew best in all the world, which was how things are built and how they come apart. She had noticed, at the last river crossing, that the old plank bridge was rotten at the near end, the grain gone soft and gray. In a way, old Peter Voss had taught her to read in a single glance. She crossed it carefully on foot, leading her horse, keeping to the sound outer stringer, and on the far side she loosened the two pegs that held the rotten planking to the frame, working fast with the chisel. She never traveled without, and that she rode on slow and let herself be seen. The rider, seeing the girl amble easily across, spurred his horse onto the bridge at a hard gallop to close the distance, and the rotten planking gave way beneath the weight and the speed, and man and horse went down into the shallow creek in a great confusion of splashing and cursing. Neither was badly hurt. But by the time the rider had dragged himself and his lamed horse out of the water, Clara Halloran was a small and vanishing shape against the northern hills, and the papers rode on. She reached the territorial land office on the fourth morning, dust to the eyebrows and swaying in the saddle, and she walked in past the astonished clerk and laid Margaret Amsden's trust upon the counter, and she made them read it, every word, the deed and the seals and the filing that the Amsdens had begun 3 years before and never finished. It took 2 days and every scrap of patience and nerve she had, because the papers had to be verified against the original territorial survey and the Amsden filing found in the old records. But the truth, once it is written down properly, is a very hard thing to unwrite. And in the end, the trust was recorded, stamped, and made law. The spring at Larkspur and the sections around it belonged to the people of Larkspur, held in common forever, exactly as a dying woman had prayed it would be. And every dollar Alden Cruz and the Overland Land and Water Company had taken for that stolen water was from that stamped morning forward, plainly and provably theft. She could have stopped there with the law on her side and 40 gold coins in her keeping and been called a heroine and lived comfortably the rest of her days. But Clara had not carried Margaret Amsden's letters 400 miles to keep the gold, and she knew what the coins had been meant for. She rode home to Larkspur, and she called the town together in the empty church, and she stood up in front of all the people who had laughed at the millman's daughter for buying a corpse, and she told them everything, and then she opened the little canvas sack and poured 40 gold double eagles across the table in the lamplight, and told them that Margaret Amsden had set that money aside to build Larkspur a school, and that she meant to see it done. She kept not one coin for herself. The town sat in stunned silence, and then old Reverend Whitcomb began quietly to pray, and by the end of it, half the room was weeping, because they had forgotten, in the long dry years of Alden Cruz, that anyone in the world would ever choose to give rather than take. Cruz fought it, of course, for men like Cruz always fight, but he fought now against the recorded law and against a town that had remembered its own spine, and it was a losing fight from the first day. When the territorial marshal came at last to examine the Overland Company's books against the trust, the whole rotten structure came apart, for the water had been the keystone of the fraud, and once it was pulled, the rest could not stand. Cruz did not go to prison, being too clever and too well lawyered for that, but he was finished in the valley. The syndicate that had backed him, seeing the water gone and the scandal spreading, cut him loose to save themselves, and he left Larkspur one gray morning in a hired buggy with far less than he'd come with, and no one came out to watch him go. And the syndicate itself, that great cold hand called Overland, took its wound in a season when it could ill afford one, for its master back east had overreached in a dozen ventures at once, and the loss of the Larkspur water was one stone too many pulled from an overloaded wall. Word came in time, carried west by the newspapers that reached even that far country, that Silas Kingsley's empire had cracked and buckled and fallen into ruin, that the great cold house on the hill in Ashford had been sold to pay his debts, and that the man himself had died not long after, alone and bitter and poor, having buried 3 wives and every friend money had ever bought him. Clara read it standing in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, and she felt no triumph, only a strange and level sorrow, and the deep, quiet knowledge that she had been right to walk out that door, and that the water had known its own back home. Her father, she learned later, had been spared the worst of it only because his mill had been too small and too failing to be worth the Kingsley Empire's ruin. He had lost it anyway, in time, to the ordinary creditors, and he lived out his last years in a rented room in Ashford, cared for by no one, the daughter he had disowned 400 miles away and building a life he would never see. She sent him money once, anonymously, through Reverend Whitcomb when she heard he was ill, because her mother had taught her that there is a use in everything if you are willing to wait for it to show itself, and she had decided that even old grief could be turned at last toward mercy. He never knew where it came from. She never told him. It was enough that she had done it. Larkspur did not become a great city. That is not the kind of story this is. But the spring ran free again, and the water was the town's own. And with the Amsden gold, they raised a good schoolhouse of sound timber. And Clara Halloran, who knew wood and machines and the patient art of making broken things whole, became its first teacher, and in time its heart. She married no one and answered to no one and was beholden to no man for her bread. And she taught the children of that valley their letters and their sums, and without ever quite saying so, taught them her mother's one great lesson, that the world is forever throwing away things of enormous worth for lack of the patience to see them clearly. The old wagon she never sold and never let rot. She had it drawn up beside the schoolhouse, and its good timber preserved, and on the anniversary of the town's founding, she would gather the children around it and lift the clever hidden floor and tell them the story of Margaret Amsden, who had carried her whole hope west in that wagon and hidden it away against the darkness, trusting that someone someday, patient enough to listen to the wood, would find it and set it free. She was 18 years old the winter she was turned out with a wool cloak, a tin of buttons, and $11 sewn into her hem, cast out by a father who thought her worthless because she would not be sold, mocked by a town for spending 9 of those dollars on a broken wagon everyone else had written off as dead. And it was precisely there, in the thing the world had discarded, in the corpse behind the livery, that she found the truth that gave a dying town its water and its faith and its future, and that quietly toppled the very man she had crossed a continent to escape. That is the meaning of what Clara Halloran did, and it is why we tell it still. The world is full of wagons behind liveries. It is full of springs that have been fenced away and letters that have gone unread, and people, most of all people, who have been sunk to their axles and left for spent. And the whole of a life can turn on whether someone is willing to kneel down in the cold and tap the floor and listen for the hollow place where something precious has been waiting all along to be found. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and for staying to the end of Clara's story. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being overlooked is not the same as being worthless, and that the things the world throws away are so often the very things that will one day save it. Before you go, we would love to hear from you, so tell us in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that others had written off? We read every one, and we carry our stories with us into the next. Until next time, dear friend, stay close.